Have you ever wondered what qualifies as a religion? Well, it is not only activity based around a metaphysical understanding of a superior being. Religion can also be defined as a belief system based on ideologies held by a person or groups of people. Beliefs such as atheism, naturalism, and even Marxism. Many people are aware that Karl Marx was a proclaimed atheist. But did you know that Marx also held to his own views of religion? He is known to have appealed to Satan, and his philosophy led him to the religion of revolution. The quest of humanity has always been the search for the idea of a good life, even as far back as Aristotle. Today, our special guest is Dr. Corey Miller, who is going to talk with us and continue the discussion on Marx and Marxisms and Marxist ideology. I'm Catherine Camp. Welcome to Faith and Culture. Let's get started. All right. Welcome back, Corey. Good to see you, and I can't wait to hear what you have for us today. I know that we're going to continue our discussion on Marxism, probably touch on some fascism, try to learn what the difference is between all of these. And so let's get started. Where do you want to start?
Yeah. Well, I think last time we discussed a little bit about uncluttering the idea of socialism, communism, fascism, capitalism, free market, a welfare state, things like that. Things that you think of when we're thinking about economic considerations and, the Cold War, communism versus the West. We oftentimes think of it in terms of, two different views of the world, but we think about it in terms of economics. Today, I'd like to get into more of what Marx thought at rock bottom about his views of religion and his view of religious belief in particular, and then how that started to manifest itself into different revolutions. I guess we would like to call Marx's religion of revolution. That's what it comes down to ultimately. Marx's religion of revolution, and see how that's manifested itself in various ways and what it's doing in America, up to a certain point. And then, next we'll then want to consider things like, critical race theory in the future.
Okay, good. All right. So do tell us.
I think, yeah.
I'm sorry. I was going to ask you, I think the last time, I'm not sure if we covered it or not, but is there a difference? I think you told me one time there was a difference between Marx and Marxism. Or is it Marxism and Marxism?
You might say Marxisms.
Okay.
And I say that because there were different schools of thought. You had the Frankfurt school of thought, the Italian and German Marxists, which would be the neo-Marxists or cultural Marxists. You had the Leninists, which was Vladimir Lenin, who, like Marx, very much loved what he saw in the French Revolution. Remember, Marx was just a boy, he was a tween, becoming a teenager, as he watched Napoleon Bonaparte, following the French Revolution, lead from, setting people free in revolution to an empire, to the emperor Napoleon himself, and all that went through. Marx loved that. Lenin loved that. And then Mao picked it up in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And that kind of communism or Marxism took on a different flavor as well. So there were different schools of thought,
Okay.
but Marx was the one who first developed it, along with his, co-author Frederick Engels.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think when we're looking at this, we can see that Marx had a religion of revolution. He had, we can almost call this, since we're thinking about this from a Christian perspective too, we can call this the tale of two Jewish revolutionaries, Marx and Jesus, and the vision of the good. And Jesus, of course, had one vision of the good, consistent with the Hebrew Old Testament, and my book that I've had published in recent times, In Search of the Good Life, through the eyes of Aristotle, Maimonides, and Aquinas, offers a view of human nature, a view of the human telos, or purpose, or end, or goal, and how we get from one to the other. And so it's an exploration of looking at perhaps the most famous Greek thinker, the most famous Jewish thinker, and the most famous Christian thinker in terms of the proliferation of their writings. Aristotle, Moses Maimonides, and Thomas Aquinas. And in good Aristotelian thought, there was also this belief in God. One of the contentions that I had in my dissertation was that Aristotle's most famous treatise on ethics was the Nicomachean Ethics, and it was about happiness. That's the end goal. Why we do what we do, why we act for the sake of some end in everything we do is because even subconsciously we think that it's going to contribute to our overall happiness for some reason. Why people are listening to this podcast, why people go to college, why they get up and do what they do each day. In some sense, every step contributes to our ultimate vision of the good. Marx was a Jew. He was the grandson of a rabbi. His dad converted to liberal Protestantism in Germany, but did so really pragmatically so that he could practice his field of law and continue to bring home the income. But Marx was raised with that kind of environment, and he wasn't a faithful Jew like Moses or like the most famous Jew, Jesus. Mm-hmm. So you might have the tale of two Jews here. And so Marx's religion, quite different from Jesus the revolutionary, who really changed the world. Yeah. The book, the Torah, that changed the world, and the New Testament Gospels. Marx inspired revolution. A lot of people want to dismiss Marx and think that any contemporary Christian talking about it in the West, in political discourse, in religious discourse, it's just conspiracy theory. And that could not be farther from the truth. We have to remember, Catherine, that aside from the Bible, the Communist Manifesto is the most sold book in human history.
Wow.
And so for us to believe that it hasn't had some impact and that it's still somehow around is just incredibly naive. So, you could look at, last time we did discuss, various revolutionaries and citations where they thought that, Marxism, communism is essentially atheistic. But today you've got, people from religious quarters, and you might know of some yourself, I don't know if you do, that might, try to wed Marxist thought or communist thought in various ways. I don't know if you've heard of thinkers that have done that.
Well, I've heard of students who are doing that. Yeah. I have, it's the
very
students,
popular.
They're falling for all of the rhetoric about the Black Lives Matter movement, and they feel like it is the Christian thing to do, to follow along and to stand behind that movement, when even people who have been wrapped up in that movement, African Americans, have stepped back from it, realizing, wait a minute, they don't care. This is not a movement about the color of your skin or being oppressed. That's what they say with their mouth, but that's not what they're doing. This is about something else. However, unfortunately, the students aren't hearing that because we have so much propaganda in the mainstream media and socialism media. So we're being kept from a lot of things that could help people make good decisions and understand better. And that's why I'm glad we're doing these segments, because people need to understand this is not a bonding of Christianity with what they're hearing these movements are about.
Right, right. And I think, the students, the college students in particular, are often highly influenced by their professors and by, thoughts of revolution or thoughts of revival. Most major revivals that have taken place in America have been, started by college students as well. So, we can even think as we get into, Marx's view of religion and what he thinks about religious belief. We might tag someone like John Lennon, not Vladimir Lenin, in how he unpacked, in his the Beatles were around 1963, but later in that decade came out with his famous single hit, Imagine. And he admits that in that number one single of all time, it was, quote, anti-religious, anti-nationalistic, anti-conventional, anti-capitalistic, but because it is sugar-coated, it is accepted, unquote. That was from Lennon. And, in that song, John Lennon, not John the Evangelist, had a gospel. He had a view of the good life. It was a Marxist ideology. He prioritized it chronologically, as I'm about to unpack Marx's view of religious belief, in terms of the criticism of religion first, and then politics second, and then economics third. If listeners think back about the song Imagine no religion, no heaven, no hell. Imagine no country. Globalism, anti-nationalism, anti-fascism, Antifa. These are globalist. These are Marxist, not fascist. They're not nationalist. No possessions. Imagine sharing everything. No property. And Marxism, some Marxists said you could summarize Marxism in one word or one expression, the abolition of private property. That's right there in the Communist Manifesto. So Lenin had this packed into his most famous single of all times. And just like in the spirit of Marx, Marx was never really ultimately about economics. And when we think about Marxism and communism, we always think about economics.
Yeah.
But economic criticism was tertiary for Marx. Prior to that had to be political criticism. And prior to that was religious criticism. So John Lennon, like Vladimir Lenin, had a lot in common here, and they followed Marx in this respect. Marx had this vision of the good, a good life, a utopia. His predictions about economics, they hardly came true. People knew he was a charlatan when it came to that. That's not to say he didn't get anything right, but his economic criticism, it was just bad. His predictions were not on. He couldn't manage his own checkbook. He never had a real job. He lived off of Engels' income and off of a modest sum that his parents gave him, and even his wife's parents gave him a maid to help out with the house. And of course, he inseminated her and had a mistress, and Marx was a terrible man.
Wow.
And then for people to look at Marxism as something attractive today, socialism, Gen Z, it's bad.
Yeah.
So, Marx came up with his theory in the context of what he called the Jewish question, right? And the Jewish question was that how are we going to get these Jews in Germany at the time to assimilate and become Germans first? They were Jews first. They saw their Jewish heritage, their identity, as being primary, German second. And that was not good for a socialist, whether that's a globalist socialist like a Marxist or a nationalist socialist like a fascist, both being socialists. And so religion at bottom was something that you had to go after because it demanded the whole of you. It was your primary allegiance. And so in his critical method, and we hear this thing called critical theory today that'll come up later, in his criticism of religion, he said that his vision ultimately entailed a classless society, so that you don't have the bourgeois and the proletariat, or the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the working class whose backs get broken by the capitalists. Marxist theory precludes serious religion, and with it, what he would call self-consciously privileged position, because serious religion is taken to proliferate rather than to exterminate class division. And again, we'll get into it later, but that's why in today's critical theory, religious criticism is an issue that we're going to be seeing more and more of, because it's viewed as separating people. Humanity cannot be fully emancipated fully until serious religion is eradicated. And so the opposition to religion to human emancipation can only be by what he called abolishing all religion. And you might get creative in thinking about how he would imagine this, to use John Lennon's term.
Yeah. And I know
remember that
people are not thinking of it that way. They just are not. That it's oil and water, that there is a right now, there's a determination to get rid of all religious language and then completely get rid of religions. And of course, they're hitting on the Christians the most, because we're for the most part silent, which is a shame. Yeah. And I heard that they're not hitting as hard, if at all, on the Islam, on the Muslim side, that it's attacking the Christians here in the United States.
Right. And in Islamic areas where Marxists might flourish, that has been a factor. But you might think about countries like Chechnya or other places like that. It would be a factor on how they would criticize Islam. But in the West, it's Christianity, right? Yeah. So, to get to political emancipation and then economic emancipation eventually, which is the final state of Marxist worldview, it starts out, in his 6 stages, which was some kind of primitive Marxism, and then slavery, and then feudalism, and then capitalism, and then socialism as the intermediate state, the dictatorship of the proletariat when revolution begins. And then somehow, some way, we just sort of slide into communist utopia. That's the 6th stage. But you've got to do a lot of work before that to get that to happen. And so one way, from Marx's viewpoint, is that his viewpoint begins from a materialist worldview. He studied some Enlightenment thinkers, from Hegel to Feuerbach and so forth. But he also studied and did his dissertation on dialectical materialism. And the materialists he studied, because most Greek philosophers were not materialists like this, were Democritus and Epicurus. And Epicurus is the one we get the statement, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. He also had views on the problem of evil. And either God is good but not all powerful, or all powerful but not all good. In either case, the Christian God cannot exist. But he starts with, you know, a materialist set of assumptions, thinks that the Enlightenment has done the death blow to traditional religion, and now we've got this hangover, this religious hangover, and it's something that needs to be eradicated, and there needs to be a way of doing it in order to get people to wake up to this class consciousness, to this, what we'll call in contemporary times, wokeness, but we're not there yet. The first way of doing that is by redistributing the wealth through economic social justice. And if that has to happen by means of revolution, so be it. And as Mao said in China, revolution is not a dinner party. We have to take one for the team. It's the end that justifies the means, right?
Yeah.
Well, once you give people what they need, equality in resources, man being an economic man, you give them all an iPhone 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. You give them all $30,000 a year, all a Toyota Corolla. Then man, of course, will never, they'll never compete. It's this doggone capitalism that causes us to compete, and we need to get rid of that. But once we do that, because this oppression is brought on by socioeconomic oppression, so the solution is socioeconomic liberation. Once we do that, we'll be in this utopia. Man will never compete for things. We'll all be the Beatles. All we need is love. We're sharing everything in common, right? But to do that, you've got to eradicate man's primary sense of need and belonging, and that is religion. And if it doesn't happen through some kind of economic redistribution or some kind of persuasion, it's got to happen through violent means. And that's his second way, which is radical revolution. And Marx, following his favorite ideal revolutionary people, and that is the French Revolution, specifically listed the guillotine, off with the heads. And it may sound inhumane, but again, the end justifies the means. And the poor religionists, you know, they just don't get it. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, he said, the sentiment of a heartless world and the soul of a soulless condition. So whereas Freud, around the same time, believed that religious belief, obviously being false, because the Enlightenment did the death blow, can be explained by some kind of internal mechanism, some kind of psychosis, some kind of wish fulfillment. And it might be hardwired, or maybe we'll call it soft-wired into the brain or something like that. Marx thought it was external. So if God does not exist, and of course we all know at that time that he doesn't, according to these thinkers, then you have to explain religious belief by either internal or external ways. Marx explained it externally through socioeconomic oppression. So he saw his mission is eradicating social economic oppression, and viewed religion as the opium of the masses, the drug of the masses. The rich people that get along during difficult times could buy the expensive drugs, the opium. But the poor people, poor in pocketbook and poor in mind, they had to get religion. And so that's what he saw as his mission. Any thoughts on that before we move on to the context of which he's saying this? Just in case
a lot of things are beginning to make sense. The other day, I heard someone talk about, I think, an electronic guillotine. And, you know, the climate is very hot right now. And I think the average person is clueless about what is going on behind the scenes. And this movement happening in our culture, they're seeing the surface. They're not seeing everything. Like, everything is historical, and it's repeating itself. It's almost like there's a playbook out there, that is being repeated, and they're not putting it all together. And that's, to me, it's just really disturbing. So that's my comment for what you just said. It's fascinating, yes, and I see us in a very dangerous spot, because this is where we're headed unless we stand up and do something about it.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous spot. And so Marx wanted to change things. He had a vision of the good, a vision of sort of a just society. I don't know how he did that on atheism, because what ground might he have to, support the notion of justice? Whereas someone like an Aristotle or Plato, right, did have grounds for the virtues and virtue ethics and so forth. But for Marx, if we truly are going to have a criticism of religion, which was his primary issue, by way of a naturalistic, atheistic explanation of religious belief, we need something in a way that discredits religious belief, something that casts doubt on it, that shows that it is not epistemologically, so it's an epistemic issue, rational issue, shows that somehow we're not playing with a full deck up here. We need some way to show that it is not epistemically respectable, and thinking people ought not believe it. And so the relevant criticism here is that religious belief is irrational. It is not produced by our cognitive faculties that are functioning properly the way they ought to function, simply because of external conditions, these poor socioeconomic conditions that are oppressing people, the working class, and all class people are deceived by these things. The oppressors especially, at least the working class, can have some kind of conscious liberation in seeing the problem. They just don't have the power to change the problem. And so we want all people everywhere to be able to, ascend to this inverted world consciousness. You take away those bad external conditions, and religious belief will shed itself like a bad snakeskin, right? And so Marx's criticism of religion isn't that God doesn't exist. He just assumed that God didn't exist, didn't bother with the arguments for it. And he just right away went to religious belief has to be irrational, and here's why. And so his criticism amounts to what Alvin Planning, a contemporary philosopher of Christianity, would call the de jure objection that concerns the rational status of religious belief. So it's an epistemic or epistemological or a theory of knowledge kind of an issue. It's not a truth or a de facto objection. It's not dealing with whether Christianity is factually true or false. He just assumes that it's false, which is a metaphysical issue.
Yeah.
His metaphysical or meta context in which his whole philosophy emerges in. The problem with that is it begs the question, who says God doesn't exist? What if God does exist? Then the shoe of who is irrational, cognitively dysfunctional, not playing with a full deck, fits on the other foot. And so I wrote an article that was published a couple of years ago in International Philosophical Quarterly that listeners might look at online, A Critique of Marx's Epistemology of Religion from Reformed Epistemology. And in thinking about this, just to kind of take the quick route, planning it goes back to the people like Thomas Aquinas, people like John Calvin of the Protestant Reformation, and calls this thing that man has this innate knowledge of God called man's sensus divinitatis, or the sense of the divine. Right. God has planted in us this natural tendency, Calvin says, to see his hand in the world around us to the extent that everyone would believe in God if it weren't for sin. So actually, the problem from Calvin's perspective is not oppression, but sin, owing to blindness. And this is where we end up getting the song Amazing Grace, I was once blind, but now I see. Mm-hmm. So were it not for the existence of sin in the world, Aquinas and Calvin would say that human beings would believe in God to the same degree and with the same natural spontaneity displayed in our belief in the existence of other persons, beliefs about the past, beliefs in other minds, because belief in God is formed in us naturally, because we're created in God's image. And this explains very well how we ground human value, that humans ought not be a means to an end, like Marx thought. That rational thought is something that could or should or would emerge from a Christian viewpoint. And lo and behold, the universities began in Judeo-Christian Europe with Bologna and Paris and Cambridge and Oxford, and moved to America with, Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Columbia. And then the first universities in Southeast Asia, in India, and South Asia, in Korea, were all not just Christian friendly, but Christ-centered. And that's because rationality is very well explained on a Christian theistic viewpoint. God is found for it. It's as true to say God is logic as it is to say God is love. And that's
Right.
why, in John's gospel, not John Lennon, but John the evangelist, he begins by saying, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and it became flesh and dwelt among us. So it's no
Sorry, I don't know
matter
what
of a
just
historical.
happened.
It said that the recording stopped and then recording in progress.
Yeah, there must be some interference today, because this has not happened before on my end. So sorry about that.
I'll just start where I did. No problem. So it's not a historical accident that the thought world of universities began in Judeo-Christian Europe and then in America and beyond. It's part of our DNA, and it's part of why Christians have an explanation of what it means for a person's rationality to be functioning properly. For Marx, he's depending on someone like Darwin, and he wanted to dedicate Das Kapital to Charles Darwin. And if you think about this is a major problem.
Yeah.
Epistemologically, it's a problem with rationality.
Yeah.
If naturalism's true, we have to wonder if we can trust our rational faculties.
Yeah.
If evolution's true, we have to. Now, if you connect both of those together, this is the naturalism plus evolution death knell of confidence and reliability of our cognitive systems.
Right.
If I evolved naturalistically, then my brain evolved. If my brain evolved, then my logic and rationality evolved. And if it evolved, how do I know it evolved correctly? And how do I know you're really here talking to me right now?
That it even makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. And what strikes me is to have such strong views and not understand that he's also ignoring basic philosophy and just the thoughts of, where did we come from? How did things begin? And not to even just to throw it out and just say no. But I guess when he was making his way into, I guess, our world, it was a time where there was a lot of rejection of God, and like you say, Darwinism, evolution. Was he influenced by, it sounds like it, by Nietzsche? Because I know Hitler was.
Yeah. Nietzsche's date, I don't think he was. I need to go back and look at that. Nietzsche was somewhat of a contemporary, the Uberman, the superhuman race. And so Nietzsche and Darwin together fused together for Hitler's view of the superhuman race, but not quite Marxism. So I have to look at those dates.
Okay.
Okay. Nietzsche. But that problem is what kills contemporary naturalists who have an evolutionary account of human origins too. Because if we're thinking about what is the purpose of man? What is the end of man? What is the good life? Everyone's after happiness. From Aristotle to contemporary times, people will say, people act for the sake of some end, for something that they think is going to bring about the good life. But I cannot know what the human telos or end or goal or purpose is if I don't know something about human nature. And Marx, I think, misread human nature. He began with the materialist philosophers, not with the most bright philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, which is why it was so easy for the Islamic, Jewish, and Christian philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, Moses Maimonides, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, to come along and baptize, so to speak, the Greek philosophers, because the universe was teleological. There was a purpose to the world. Darwin put an end to that in terms of human origins. Marx came along and gave not a scientific view of our nature, but of our good. And that is a communist utopian society that John Lennon sings about, right? But the Marxists have never, ever in any place really told us how to get there. And it always, always, always ends up in massive bloodshed. How do we characterize Marxism? Do we characterize it by body count? 100 million people at the end of last century, through Mao, through Stalin, through Lenin, through Southeast Asia to Cuba, something's happening in Africa, South Central America. It's been a very bloody Red Army that has tried to, satisfy Marx's view of religion. And that's why it's scary that millennials in America today and Gen Zers are very attached to or mesmerized by or attracted to socialism. They don't remember history.
No.
And that's where George Santayana, the philosopher, said, we study history, for those who don't remember the past, they are condemned to repeat it.
Yeah.
So I guess I would conclude, thinking on this section with Marx's view of religion, that in terms of religious belief, if naturalism is true and some view of evolution is true, then it means that having confidence in my noetic structure, in my cognitive equipment, in my rational thinking up here has got a major problem. It's fraught with its own self-defeater internally. And you get many atheists who speak about this, that we have to remember, Dawkins said, that we have to remember that the world seems designed, it appears designed, but it's ultimately not. Others have talked about that in terms of rationality, confidence in our sense perceptions, in confidence in morality. So that Alec Rosenberg, who was at Purdue University, and I moderated a debate with him and William Lane Craig, said that there are no obligations, no permissions, no moral absolutes, no right or wrong. Nature has simply fobbed off on us a sense of right and wrong for our survival. And here's the problem. Evolution will be about survival, so that our survival adaptivity will have a genetic predisposition to traits that will cause the species, if you will, to survive. But there are plenty of examples of why this gives us a lack of confidence in our beliefs, including our belief in naturalism plus evolution. Let me give you one example. It seems pretty obvious that we have reliable sense perceptions. We have science, right? And we've got technology and so much development along those lines. But if naturalism plus evolution are true, then my mind is built for survival, not to produce true beliefs. If we're in the jungle or on the Serengeti and we both see a lion coming, and I have a problem with my depth perception and yours are relatively accurate, you see it as coming 1,000 yards away. I see it 100 yards away. Which of us is going to be the first one to flight and run for their lives? Me. you might be like that tourist who goes to Yellowstone National Park and tries to get a pretty picture of the bison or the bears or the moose and get killed, right? And so it serves the purposes of evolution to give false perceptual beliefs. And so if we cannot have confidence, Marx's whole system is fraught with problems there. But the Christian position has a very good answer to what is proper function, why we should expect that truth claims, higher level truth claims in algebraic equations, in mathematics, and abstract reasoning, and so forth are there. And the proof is in the pudding. We began the universities. The naturalists did not, and certainly not the Marxist naturalists.
Right. Yeah, those are excellent points. And I hope everyone watching is taking notes, because these aren't things that people think about. And I think, and you work in universities too. And I just, what I see is the grammar education, that's, you know, elementary school and then the high school, has been dumbed down to the extent that people don't have a good picture of history. And in our own culture in the United States, it's also been hijacked and told in a different way, which has also been very harmful. But it was intentional. I don't think many of us saw that coming. I certainly didn't as a parent, and I was really on top. I think I focused more on science than I did anything else because of the things I had to stand up for. But the historical part, I would never have imagined that it was being rewritten.
Right. It's a revisionist history. And I think, you know, our people that we interact with and people listening or watching this need to remember that Marxism is a worldview. It is a worldview. It has a view about what a human is and what a human or a human collective is to become. And it cannot accept religion. It's got to abolish religion. And this is why in contemporary times, it's rather odd to think that Christians are trying to baptize some Marxist theories. And I hope to get into that in the future.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Corey. This is really important stuff and very timely for our day. And frankly, I believe it's life and death, the way we educate ourselves right now and spread the truth. Because this has, for many of us, creeped in, but I am now wide awake and trying to learn as much as possible. And I want to spread that truth out more and more. So next time we will get more into, I just want to make sure we covered everything here. Oh, yeah. Can you just kind of give us a teaser on colonialism or colonization, sorry, and critical theory?
Yeah. So for that, and that's where I think we'd like to go next, is during Marxist time, roughly the 19th century, you're well underway with especially Western European countries colonizing the world. In America, North, South America, the East Indies, Africa, from the Dutch to the French to the English, the Portuguese, and so forth. Marxism has morphed, and it needs to decolonize many of the things that were very fundamental in the way of thinking with those new cultures, because as Europe colonized, it brought with it the fundamental thinking of Christian thought, of capitalism, of nation states, so a national perspective, of equal rights, of equality of human persons that are made in the image of God, that governments can't give or take away from those rights because they are endowed by our Creator. Marxism, in its new fashions in our country, is in the process of trying to repudiate and decolonize those many things.
Okay. Well, great. I can't wait to get into that next. Thank you so much for being here.
All right. Thanks, Catherine.